The snow had been falling since before dawn. Eli Callum knew it before he opened his eyes. He had lived 41 years on this land, 30 of them in this cabin, and winter had taught him to read its moods the way other men read scripture, with patience, with reverence, and with the uneasy understanding that it could kill you if you stopped paying attention. The silence that preceded heavy snowfall had a weight to it, a held breath quality that pressed against the walls of the cabin like something alive. He lay still in the gray light for a moment, listening to that silence, then rose without hurry. The fire in the hearth had burned to coals overnight. He rebuilt it methodically, split pine first, dry and quick, then a fat round of pine on top that would hold through the morning. The cabin filled with the smell of wood smoke, clean and sharp, and Eli stood at the small window above the dry sink and looked out at the world he knew. The Rockies in November were not a romantic thing. They were a practical, unforgiving thing, all weight and gray and white. The pines along the ridge bent under the snow's accumulation, their branches drooping in long, silent gestures of exhaustion. The yard between the cabin and the barn was a smooth, unbroken field of white, save for the tracks of a single mule deer that had passed some time in the night, thin and tentative, already filling in. Beyond the yard, the mountain rose steeply into cloud. Below the cabin, the trail that wound 6 miles down to the nearest settlement, a loose cluster of buildings called Hadley's Cross, was invisible beneath 2 feet of snow and getting deeper. He was alone. He had been alone for most of his adult life, not through misfortune exactly, though there had been misfortune enough, but through the accumulation of choices, each one small and reasonable at the time, that had led him here, to this high place, to this particular quiet. He had a ranch, 60 acres of mountain meadow and timber, 3 horses, 11 cattle, and a sway-backed mule named August. He had the cabin his father had built and he had maintained and expanded, one careful room at a time over the decades. He had provisions enough to last a winter most years. He had, he supposed, everything a man needed, and not much else. He pulled on his coat and boots and went out to tend the animals. The cold hit him the way it always did in the deep of November, not gradually, but all at once, pressing against his face and hands with a blind animal insistence. He moved through it with the efficiency of long habit, breaking the ice in the water trough with the blunt end of an axe, spreading hay in the barn, checking the horses one by one. They were calm, as they usually were in bad weather. Horses seemed to understand that foul weather required stillness, a kind of equine meditation that Eli had always quietly admired. He spoke to them in the low, even voice he used for animals and for himself, telling them the snow was deep and they would rest today, telling them nothing they did not already know. He was on his way back from the barn, the cold working its way through his coat, when he saw the shape. It was at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 40 yards from the cabin, where the pines gave way to the open yard. At first, he took it for a fallen branch, or perhaps a deer brought down in the night. The shape was low and dark against the white, half buried already, and it did not move. He stopped walking and looked at it for several seconds before his mind resolved the image into what it actually was.
A person on the ground, face down in the snow. He was running before the thought fully formed, his boots punching through the snow's crust, his breath loud in his own ears. He reached the figure and dropped to one knee and turned it over and found a young woman.
She was perhaps 25, perhaps younger. It was hard to tell beneath the cold's damage to her face, which had taken on the waxy, bluish pallor that Eli had seen before and recognized with grim clarity as the border country between living and not. Her clothing was wrong for the mountains. A dark wool traveling dress, a coat that might have been adequate in a city in October, but was nothing against a Rocky Mountain November. Thin leather boots with no insulation, no gloves. Her hair was dark and had come mostly loose from whatever it had been arranged in, and it lay across the snow around her face like something spilled.
Her lips were moving, just barely, just slightly, but they were moving. He lifted her without ceremony and carried her toward the cabin. She was lighter than he expected, which worried him. He had seen hard cold strip weight from a person the way water strips color from cloth. Inside, he laid her on the rope bed near the fire, which was the warmest place in the cabin. He took her boots off and found her feet cold and pale but not blackened. No frostbite had taken hold yet, though it had been reaching for her. Her hands were the same. He piled blankets on her, every blanket he owned, and then added his coat and a horse blanket from the hook by the door, and he put another log on the fire and stoked it until the hearth roared. Then he sat in the chair across from her and waited. He had no training as a doctor. What he knew about freezing he had learned from the mountains themselves and from old Amos Treadwell, who had kept cattle on the adjacent range for 20 years before his heart gave out, and who had once thawed a ranch hand out of near death with whiskey and blankets and the conviction that God wasn't done with the man yet. Eli did not have Amos's certainty about God's intentions, but he had whiskey, and he had blankets, and he had a fire hot enough to make the cabin feel like a different world from the one outside. The warming took time. He watched her color return slowly, painfully, the way dawn returns, not all at once, but incrementally, the grayness giving way to something with more pink in it, something more like life. She shivered. She shivered for a long time, her whole body shaking beneath the pile of blankets, and Eli sat and watched and fed the fire and did not touch her except once, briefly, to press the back of his forehead against her forehead and confirm that warmth was coming back to her.
She woke in the early afternoon. He was at the stove when he heard the change in her breathing, the shallow, unconscious rhythm of a person somewhere between sleep and whatever lay beyond it, giving way to the deeper, more deliberate breath of a person returning to themselves. He turned and found her eyes open. They were dark brown, very dark, and they held an expression he recognized, the particular blend of confusion and terror that belongs to people who wake in strange places and do not yet know if they are safe. He stayed where he was. He did not move toward her. He understood instinctively that the worst thing he could do in that moment was loom over her, and so he remained at the stove, a pan of broth in his hands, and he spoke first. "You're all right," he said. "You're in a cabin. You're warm. Nobody here but me." She looked at him for a long time. The shivering had mostly stopped. Her eyes moved around the cabin, the log walls, the fire, the blankets, the single window dark with snowfall, and then returned to him. "How long?" she said. Her voice was rough, barely a voice at all. "I found you maybe 4 hours past. Sun's going down soon." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. The raw terror had not gone away exactly, but it had gone deeper, covered over by something more controlled. "I need to leave," she said. "You can't," he said. "Storm's still coming down and you nearly froze to death this morning. You go back out there dressed the way you are, you won't come back." She said nothing to this. She seemed to be calculating something behind her eyes. "Can you sit up?" he asked.
She could, with difficulty. He brought her the broth, beef, thin but hot, and set it on the small table beside the bed and retreated to his chair. She watched him retrieve himself to that distance, and something in her posture relaxed, infinitesimally. "I'm Eli Callum," he said. "This is my ranch. You're on my land." She wrapped both hands around the tin cup of broth and said, "Clara." A pause. Clara Marsh. He nodded, as though this were enough, because it was. He did not ask where she had come from or where she had been going, because in his experience, people told you what they wanted you to know when they were ready to tell it, and pressing them only made them smaller and more careful. He asked instead if she was hungry beyond the broth, and she said yes, and he made cornbread and heated the last of a venison stew he had put up 3 days ago, and they ate on either side of the fire in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the wind picked up as evening came on. It came in from the northwest, off the high peaks, and it had real violence in it, not the tired, aimless wind of early season storms, but the committed, purposeful wind of a winter that had decided to make a point. The cabin responded with its familiar winter language, the pop of logs, the faint whistle through the gap above the north window he had been meaning to fill for 3 years, the deep bone settling of the structure itself against the cold. She listened to it. He watched her listen, watched her track each sound and locate it the way a person does when they are genuinely afraid of what the darkness outside might contain. He had thought at first that she was afraid of the storm. He began to think it was something else. "You come from Hadley's Cross?" he asked, finally.
She took a moment before answering. "From the east side of the pass," she said. "I was traveling." He let that sit. The east side of the pass in November was not a sensible place for a lone woman in city clothes to be traveling. He did not say so. "Is there someone expecting you somewhere?" he asked. He kept his voice neutral, transactional. "Anyone who might be searching?" Another pause, longer. "No," she said. "There's no one." He looked at her. She was looking at the fire. The firelight did things to her face that winter light had no patience for. It put warmth in her color and softened the corners of her expression, and he could see that she was, beneath the exhaustion and the cold's damage and whatever fear was running in her, a person of considerable composure. She held herself with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was a kind of armor. "All right," he said. "Then you'll stay until the storm breaks. It'll be a few days at least." She turned and looked at him directly for the first time. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You're not," he said. "There's a second room in the back. It's cold, but I'll put a stove grate in the wall, and it'll be warmer than the mountain." He paused. "You'll be safe," he added, and meant it in the simplest and most literal way, and she seemed to understand that he meant it that way, because some of the remaining tension went out of her shoulders. He gave her the back room and hung a wool blanket across the doorway for privacy, and he spent the first night on a bedroll by the fire. The storm lasted 4 days. He had seen worse storms in his time on this mountain. The winter of 1882 had buried the cabin to the roofline and kept him inside for 2 weeks. But this one had a steady, grinding determination that wore at a person. The wind did not relent. The temperature dropped until the thermometer he kept nailed to the porch post read 22 below zero, and he stopped checking it after that because the number was no longer useful information. He kept the fire going around the clock, burning through his woodpile at a rate that made him mildly anxious, and he told himself that it would turn, that it always turned, and in the meantime he went about the work of being alive in a small space with another person. It was slow work. It required a kind of attention he had not exercised in a long time. She was careful around him in those first 2 days, careful in the way that animals are careful in unfamiliar territory, moving quietly, taking up as little space as possible, asking for nothing she did not absolutely need. She helped without being asked, washing the tin plates after meals, folding the blankets, carrying wood from the pile on the porch to the box beside the hearth. She did these things efficiently and without comment, as though she were completing a transaction rather than offering a kindness, and he let her do them because he understood that usefulness was a kind of dignity, and she needed all the dignity she could hold on to right now. He found gradually that he was adjusting his own habits to the presence of another person.
He was quieter than usual at his work, less inclined to talk aloud to himself in the absent-minded way he had developed over years of solitude. He was more deliberate in his movements, more aware of the cabin's small geography. He had not realized, until her presence made him aware of its absence, how thoroughly he had stopped thinking of the cabin as a shared space. It had become, over the years, simply an extension of himself, his habits printed on every surface, his routines worn into the floorboards like tracks. Having another person in it was strange in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. On the afternoon of the second day, he found her standing at the north window, looking out at the storm. She had one hand raised and pressed flat against the cold glass, and she was perfectly still. He stood in the doorway of the back room where he had been doing some repairs and watched her for a moment before she heard him. "It's beautiful," she said without turning around. "In a terrible way." "Yes," he said. "Do you ever get used to it?" He thought about this honestly. "You get used to surviving it," he said. "The beauty stays strange."
She turned then, and there was something in her face, an openness that had not been there before, a brief unguarding. And she almost said something. He could see the shape of it forming. Then she closed it off again, gently, the way you close a book you have not finished. He went back to his repairs. That evening he showed her how to splice a rope, not because she needed to know it, but because his hands needed something to do, and the silence had grown to a size that required navigation. She watched him work through the first demonstration, and then took the rope herself and tried it, and she was precise and quick at it, which surprised him. He said so. "My grandmother kept horses," she said. "I spent summers with her when I was a girl." "Good horses?" "Arabians, mostly. She had opinions about horses." A small pause. "She had opinions about most things." "Where was that?" She glanced up from the rope. "Virginia," she said, "a long time ago." He let it rest there. Virginia. A woman from Virginia in wool traveling clothes on a Rocky Mountain trail in November. The pieces did not form a picture he could read, and he did not try to read them. He watched her hands on the rope and thought that she had been taught things, expensive things, the kind of things that required leisure and instruction, and that she was very far from wherever those lessons had been given. On the third day, the cold eased slightly, enough that he could venture out to tend the animals and check the woodpile without risking serious harm. She asked to come with him. He looked at her for a moment, considering the cold against whatever it was that had made her ask.
"There's a spare coat on the hook," he said. "Heavier than yours." She put on the coat, which was his old working coat and was enormous on her, reaching nearly to her knees, and she pulled on a pair of his wool gloves that swallowed her hands entirely. She looked, he thought, like a child dressed in her father's clothes, except that her eyes were not a child's eyes. Outside, the world was devastatingly white and still. The storm had passed its peak and lay now in the exhausted aftermath of its own violence, the air sharp and clean and thin. She stopped in the yard and tilted her face upward, and he saw her eyes close for a moment, saw her breathe it in, and there was something unguarded and young in her face that he looked away from because it felt private. In the barn, she was easy with the horses. She moved among them without hesitation and with the natural authority of someone who had spent real time with large animals, not the nervous deference of a person performing comfort. She spoke to one of the mares, a gray named Pearl, in a low conversational tone, and Pearl dropped her nose into the woman's gloved hands with complete and immediate trust. "You said your grandmother had horses," he said. "I said that." "You know them?" "I do." She stroked Pearl's nose with a firmness that the horse leaned into. "I used to think horses were the most honest creatures. They don't pretend to feel things they don't feel." He said nothing to this. He was listening to what lay beneath it. "People pretend a great deal," she said. She was still looking at the horse, not at him. "I have pretended a great deal." He began filling the water trough with the bucket from the well. "I expect most people have. Not the way I have."
He looked at her. She was not going to say more than that, not yet, but there was something she was carrying toward him in small increments, testing the weight of it, deciding how much he could be trusted to hold. That night, after supper, she sat across from him at the small table with her hands around a cup of coffee. He had only a little coffee left and was rationing it, but he had made 2 cups tonight. And she said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," he said. "Why do you live up here alone?" He considered the question without offense. "Because it suits me," he said. Then, because that was not quite honest enough, because I tried living among people and found I was better at this. She studied him. "Something happened," she said. It was not a question. "Things happen," he said. "A wife once, a long time ago. She died of fever. I had a partner for the ranch for some years after that, but he moved on." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "After a while, you stop waiting to feel ready for company and you just stop." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had dropped completely, and the night was utterly silent in the way the deep mountain nights become, a silence so thorough it seems to have texture. "My name is not Clara Marsh," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the table, at her own hands. "My name is Eleanor Voss. My father is Charles Voss." She said the name the way people say names they have grown wary of carrying. "He owns land and mines and several things in addition to those. He is a significant man in certain parts of Colorado."
Eli was still. He knew the name. Anyone who had been in these mountains for 20 years knew the name of Charles Voss, who had broken men over money and territory the way other men broke rocks. He did not say this. "I was to be married," she continued, "in the first week of December, to a man named Hartwell, whom my father chose because their business interests aligned, and because I had nothing to say about it that he considered worth hearing." She paused. "He is not a cruel man, I think, but he is not a kind one, and I could not." She stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked at the fire. "You ran," he said. "3 weeks ago. I got as far as Denver, and then I thought I could get further." She looked at him finally, and her eyes were clear and steady, no tears in them, but he could see what the clarity was costing her. "I was a fool. I thought the mountain pass would be navigable. Everyone I asked said to wait for spring, and she shook her head. "I thought I knew better." He sat with this for a while. The fire popped softly. Outside, a night bird called once and then was silent. "Your father will be looking for you," he said. "Yes. He'll have men out. When the storm breaks, yes." She said this evenly, but her hands tightened slightly around the cup. "He has a great many resources." "And the man you were to marry?" "Hartwell will do whatever my father directs him to do. He does not particularly want me, he wants the association." A pause. "I think that is perhaps the worst part, that I am being arranged like furniture." Eli looked at the fire. He was thinking several things at once, sorting through them with the methodical patience that years of solitude had given him. She had come to him as a stranger in need, and he had helped her as one helps a stranger in need, without condition, because that was the law of the mountains. You helped the person in front of you because it could be you next time, and because there was no one else to do it. And now she was sitting across from him with her real name in the air between them, and she was not a stranger anymore, and she was also not safe. "What will you do," he asked, "if you get out of here, if the storm breaks and you go down the mountain?" "I don't know," she said, and the honesty of this, the plain, undefended admission of it, landed in the room with more weight than anything she had said before. "I have very little money. I have the name of a woman in Salt Lake City who my grandmother knew,
who I thought might, but I don't know if she's still there or if she would—" She stopped. "I don't know," she said again. He nodded slowly. "You're angry with me," she said. He looked up. "For what?" "For not telling you who I was, for using a false name." He thought about this honestly. "I'm not angry," he said. "I understand why you did it. But you might have made different choices if you'd known." "I wouldn't have," he said. "You were nearly frozen to death in my yard. That's the only thing that would have mattered." He looked at her steadily. "It's still the only thing that matters." She stared at him. Something moved across her face, something between gratitude and grief, too complex and too private to name.
"I have been careful around people for a very long time," she said quietly. "I have learned to be careful." "I know," he said. "I can see it." "It's exhausting," she said. And then, as though surprised by her own words, she gave a short, helpless sound that was almost a laugh. "That's a childish thing to say." "It's not," he said. She looked at the fire for a long moment. He could see her deciding something, working through some internal deliberation with the focus of a person who had very few safe spaces left in which to deliberate. When she looked back at him, something in her posture had shifted, not yielding exactly, but open in a way it had not been before. "Will you tell me how you built this place?" she asked. "The cabin. I'd like to know." It was not what he expected her to say. He was quiet for a moment, and then he began to talk. He told her about his father, who had come from Ohio with a wife and 3 children, and the conviction that the mountains held something worth having. He told her about the first cabin, which was really only one room with a dirt floor, and how they had expanded it winter by winter, one log at a time, each addition representing a season survived. He told her about the summer he had spent alone on this land at the age of 19, after his father died and his mother and siblings went back east, and how he had decided in that summer, not dramatically, not with any great resolution, but gradually, like water finding a level, that this was where he belonged.
She listened with complete attention. She asked questions that were careful and genuine, about the construction, about the animals, about what the summers looked like in contrast to this white and brutal season, and he answered them, finding to his own mild surprise that he had a great deal to say, that there was a considerable amount of his life that had been sitting unspoken for lack of anyone to speak it to, and that it fit easily into language now that there was someone to receive it. The night deepened. The fire burned low, and he built it back up. They stayed at the table long past the hour at which he would normally have gone to sleep, and the conversation moved at its own pace, unhurried, finding its own way through the dark. She told him about Virginia, about her grandmother's farm, and the smell of the horses, and the particular quality of a Virginia summer, heavy and green and loud with insects, that was so unlike anything here that it seemed to belong to a different world. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 12, and how her father had changed after that, hardened, turned his grief into ambition the way some men do, as though the world owed him a profit for his suffering. She told him about the education she had been given, careful and expensive, and designed to produce a certain kind of woman, a decorative and obedient woman, and how she had taken everything they had taught her and gone slightly sideways with it, reading books she was not supposed to read, forming opinions she was not supposed to form, becoming someone her father genuinely did not understand. "He loves me," she said. "I believe that, but he doesn't see me. He sees the idea of me, the daughter who does what is required and confirms his standing and does not trouble him." She shook her head. "I stopped being that person some time ago, and he has not quite noticed."
"No," he said. "I'm telling you the conditions. What you do with them is your business." She crossed to the window and stood beside him, looking out. She was close enough that he could hear her breathe. Outside, a small avalanche of snow slid off a pine branch and landed in a soft explosion in the yard below. "If I go to Hadley's Cross," she said slowly, "there will be people who recognize the Voss name, who will send word." "Likely." "And my father's men will have reached Hadley's Cross by now, if not before the storm." "Likely," he said again. She was quiet for a while. The blue sky outside was so still after days of wind that it seemed stunned by its own calm. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I have done enough pretending." "All right." She turned and looked at him directly. "I am not a person without resources. My grandmother left me money, not a large sum but a real one, in a trust that my father cannot touch. It is in a bank in Salt Lake City. If I can get there—" "It's a long way in winter," he said. "I know." She did not look away. "But if I can get there, I can begin. I can find some way to be something other than—" She paused. "Something other than arranged." He looked at her. He thought of what it had cost her to be standing here, the calculation she had made, the risk she had taken, the sheer stubborn refusal to be what someone else had decided she should be. He thought about the kind of courage that looked like running, that looked like foolishness, that looked like a woman half frozen in the snow at the edge of a stranger's property. And that was, underneath all of that, the most fundamental kind of courage there was.
"There's a stage line out of Hadley's Cross," he said. "Runs west toward the Utah border when the weather permits. In another week or two, it might be running again." He paused. "You could wait here." She looked at him for a long moment. "That would be a great imposition." "You asked me once if I got used to the beauty of it," he said. "I told you the beauty stays strange. That's true." He kept his voice even, matter-of-fact, because he was a matter-of-fact man and did not know how else to be. "But the strangeness can be the good kind sometimes, the kind that reminds you the world is bigger than you thought." She was very still, looking at him. He felt the weight of what he had just said, not because it was dramatic or extraordinary, it was neither. It was plain and simple and sincere, but because he had said it at all, because he had let it out of the interior where he had kept such things for a long time. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, for the second time since she had arrived. "You said that before," he said, "and I gave you the same answer then as I'm giving you now." She looked at the window, at the blazing white and blue outside, and he could see her weighing it, the risk of Hadley's Cross against the safety of this high, quiet place, the known danger of the world below, against the strange and provisional shelter of a rancher's cabin and a rancher's trust. He did not press her. He went to the stove and began making breakfast, cornmeal mush, a thin rasher of the last of the salt pork, and he listened to her breathe behind him and waited. "A week," she said finally, "maybe 10 days, until the stage is running." He turned down the heat on the stove. "All right," he said. She sat at the table and folded her hands and looked at them. He could see the relief moving through her, the releasing of some held thing, and he looked away from it because it was private.
"Eli," she said. He turned. "Thank you." She said it plainly, without elaboration, the way a person says a true thing, not to fill the air, but to place it there, where it can be witnessed. "Don't mention it," he said, and turned back to the stove. The days that followed had a different quality from the storm days. They were purposeful days, shaped by work and the particular discipline of winter survival, and within them a kind of ease developed between the two of them that surprised him each time he noticed it. She learned the rhythms of the ranch quickly, the morning routine, the wood that needed splitting, the way the horses needed to be exercised even in the cold, and she participated in them without being asked and without making ceremony of the participation.
She was simply there, in the way that another person could simply be there when they had found the right frequency, when their presence did not grate or demand, but simply added itself to the existing texture of a life. He taught her other things. He taught her to read the sky the way he read it, to see in the color of the western clouds whether weather was coming or spent. He showed her the particular tracks the elk left in the new snow, different from deer, different from the cattle. He took her up to the upper meadow on snowshoes one afternoon when the cold had eased to something merely uncomfortable, and she stood at the edge of the meadow and looked down the long white slope toward the valley below, where Hadley's Cross was an invisible smudge in the distance, and above it the peaks rose in their blue and white silence, and she said nothing for several minutes. "I used to think silence meant something was wrong," she said finally. "At home there was always noise, people, horses, someone wanting something. And now?"
She considered the question. "Now it sounds like room," she said, "like there's room for something." He nodded. He understood this precisely. She told him more about herself in the days that followed, in the incremental way that trust reveals itself, not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece a small test, each test passed, making the next piece easier. She told him about the books she had read in secret, the ideas that had taken root in her and refused to be removed by her father's practicality or Hartwell's polished indifference. She told him about the woman in Salt Lake City who was her grandmother's oldest friend and who had, according to her grandmother's deathbed whisper, ideas that Charles Voss would consider dangerous, and who had built a small school on the edge of the city for girls who were not being given anywhere else to go. She told him this last part with a careful excitement, a hope she was still protecting from examination, as though it might not survive being looked at directly. "You could teach," he said. She looked at him with something close to wonder. "You say that as though it's obvious." "Isn't it?" She was quiet. "No one has ever said that to me before," she said. "Not like that, not as though it were simply a fact." He shrugged. "It's simply a fact." She looked down. He saw something move across her face, something old and complicated and slowly releasing its grip. On the 9th day, he rode down to Hadley's Cross and confirmed what he had hoped. The stage was running again, weather permitting, on the following Wednesday. He bought a few provisions and asked discreetly about Voss men, and the barkeeper at the Cross, who was a man of long experience with other people's complications and who knew when not to elaborate on what he knew, simply told him the weather had kept most traffic down for a week and the roads were still rough. He came back up the mountain in the last of the afternoon light and found her at the table with a piece of his paper, writing something in a close, careful hand.
She put it down when he came in. "Wednesday," he said. "Stage west." She nodded. "Good," she said. And he heard what was beneath the word, the mixture of relief and grief that accompanies every necessary departure. That evening she cooked, a thing she had offered to do before and he had politely deflected, as cooking was one of the few domestic arts he had mastered. But tonight he accepted, and she produced from his basic provisions a dish of unexpected complexity, something with dried herbs she had found on his shelf that he had never used. They ate by the fire, and afterward she said, "I want you to know something." "All right." "When I came to, when I woke up that first day and found myself here, I was terrified." She said this evenly, looking at the fire. "Not of the cold, of you, of being at the mercy of a stranger." He nodded. "And then," she paused, "you stayed across the room. You brought me food and you stayed across the room. And I thought, this is a person who understands that there are some things you cannot take from someone, even when you have every material advantage. You stayed across the room." He was quiet for a moment. "You were already frightened," he said. "There was nothing to be gained from frightening you more." "No," she agreed, "but most men would not have thought about it that way." She looked at him. "You are a good man, Eli Callum." He looked at the fire. He was not accustomed to this kind of direct assessment and did not know entirely what to do with it, but he found that he did not want to deflect it. He wanted, for once, to simply receive it. "You're going to be all right," he said. "In Salt Lake City, whatever it looks like from here, you're going to be all right."
She was quiet for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because you walked into a mountain in November rather than spend your life being someone else's arrangement," he said. "A woman like that generally manages." She looked at him, and he could see that she was fighting something, some old discipline against showing what she felt. And then she stopped fighting it, and she simply sat there in the firelight with her real face on, the complicated and private and genuine face that had been revealing itself small piece by small piece over the course of 9 days. "I will write to you," she said, "if that's all right." "It's all right," he said. "And if I—" She stopped, started again. "I have not been able to think very far ahead. It has not been safe to think very far ahead." "You don't have to," he said. "Take it one thing at a time." She nodded slowly. Outside, the mountains were quiet under their enormous sky, and the fire was warm, and the darkness outside the window was a simple and benign darkness, the ordinary darkness of a winter night on a mountain that had decided, for now, to be peaceful. He looked at it and thought, "Here is a person who came out of that darkness and sat at my table and told me the truth of herself, and I am the better for having known it, and she will carry some piece of this place with her, and I will carry some piece of her forward into whatever days I have left, and that is how it works. That is the whole ordinary and improbable miracle of it." On Wednesday morning, he saddled Pearl for her. She looked at him when she saw which horse he'd chosen. "I can't take your horse," she said. "It's alone," he said. "Leave her at the livery in Hadley's Cross. They'll bring her back." He paused. "She's steadier than the others on snow." She looked at Pearl for a moment, then at him. She was wearing her own coat now, cleaned and dried, and the spare gloves he had given her and which she had kept, and she was carrying the small bag she had arrived with, which contained the few possessions she had managed to hold on to. She looked, he thought, like a person at the beginning of something. He helped her mount and checked the girth and then stepped back. "Eli," she said. He looked up at her. "Thank you," she said again, just as she had said it on the morning the storm broke, plainly, without elaboration, the way a true thing is said. "Get down the mountain before it clouds up again," he said. She smiled, not the brief, surprised smile of their first days, but a full one, clear and steady and warm, carrying everything in it that they had found their way to over the course of 9 days, the trust built slowly out of small things, the recognition of one quiet person by another, the knowledge that it was possible, even now, even in the middle of a winter and a flight and a life that had not gone according to anyone's plan, to find a place that felt, if only for a moment, like the right size. She turned Pearl toward the trail and rode out of the yard. He watched her until the trees took her, which was not long. The pines closed around her, and she was gone, and the yard was his again, unbroken white, the snow holding the impression of the horse's hooves in a clean line from the barn to the tree line, evidence of passage, evidence of something that had happened here. He stood in the cold for a while, without moving. The sky to the west was clear and blue and enormous, and the mountains rose into it with their customary indifference, their beauty that stayed strange, their silence that was the good kind. He had lived here for 30 years and would live here for whatever years remained to him, and the world below would go on as it always had, full of arrangements and ambitions and people who mistook force for wisdom. And somewhere to the west, a woman who had been nearly swallowed by a November mountain was riding toward a life she had chosen for herself, carrying her own name again, and the knowledge, he believed this, he held on to it,
that she was capable of surviving far more than she had been told to expect of herself. He went back inside and built up the fire and set the kettle on. Outside, the light on the snow was very bright, the way light gets after a storm has moved through when the air has cleared, and a whole world looked, in that particular brightness, like something just beginning. He sat in his chair by the fire, and the cabin settled around him with its familiar sounds, the pop of the logs, and the faint whistle at the window, and the deep bone sound of the structure itself. And after a while he became aware that the silence, which had for 30 years been simply the absence of other people, had changed its quality slightly, had taken on a different texture, the way a room changes when something has happened in it, when it has been the site of something real. He sat with that for a while.
Then he got up and found a piece of paper and a pencil, and he sat back down at the table, and after a long moment of looking at the blank paper, he began to write his address at the top, clearly, so she would know where to send the letter when she was settled, when Salt Lake City had opened itself to her, when she had found the school and the woman and the beginning of whatever shape her life was going to take. He folded the paper and set it on the table and looked at it. Outside, a raven landed on the top rail of the porch fence, folded its wings with a small, deliberate motion, and looked in through the window at him with its bright and absolute attention, and then it was gone, pushing off into the cold blue air, riding the updrafts off the ridge, carrying itself south toward warmer country. He watched the empty sky where it had been for a moment. Then he put the paper in his coat pocket and went out to tend the horses.